Welcome once again to Tolkiewood TV for a new video, and I hope you'll take just a moment right now to like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. By subscribing and pressing that little bell icon, it's the best way to be notified of whenever there's a new video. But remember, there's a new video every Tuesday, so be on the lookout for that. Hashtag Tolkiewood TV Tuesday. Now, you might recall from my video about Roadshow movie programs that I showed you this program from My Fair Lady, from my collection, sort of this hardcover celebration of that very significant film that was shown in Roadshow engagements. And I also pointed out that it's not just musicals. Roadshow movies also included epics like Around the World in 80 Days. And this is another great program, quite elaborate, really a book more than a program, with all kinds of color photos and also lots of information about the making of the movie. So these programs are usually quite interesting in their own right. And since as we film this, it's Holy Week leading up to Easter, I thought we would take a look at some of the biblical epics that were presented in the Roadshow format. These famous stories lent themselves very well to the epics that were so favored for Roadshow presentations. So there were such films as The Ten Commandments, King of Kings, and yes, the Bible. In the beginning, now that I've set that all up, I'm going to talk about something that's not biblical, the Agony and the Ecstasy, but it's biblically related. Because, of course, this is the story of Michelangelo painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel starting in 1508 at the request, more like a command, of Pope Julius II. The film was accompanied by this really beautiful, elaborate, even if it is a soft cover, program that gave all kinds of background. Here is Rome in 1505, the Vatican area, in the time of Michelangelo. Very poetic photography and art. Background on who Pope Julius II was is portrayed in the film by Rex Harrison, following up his Academy Award-winning role in My Fair Lady. Really incredible. All the beauty and information that went into these programs that gave you so much information on the Roadshow films. As you probably know, the art on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel portrays mostly stories from the book of Genesis. But let me also just point out this incredible fold-out, which gives us this really wonderful look at the Sistine Chapel ceiling. I really should show it like this. It's hard to know how to show this, really, because, of course, they're trying to get the ceiling and also the chapel below. But incredibly, there's this little diagram here that shows the different sections of the painting on the ceiling and what's represented and some background on that. So this is a great example of a really elaborate program that gives so much information. Now, it's interesting to note that the Agony and the Ecstasy was produced by 20th Century Fox. That means that it's now owned by Disney. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and say that the Sistine Chapel is owned by Disney, but I wouldn't be surprised. And speaking of Disney, we have a Disney connection with one of these films I'm going to be talking about, so stay tuned for when I bring that up. I think you'll find it quite surprising. Now, I've already mentioned King of Kings, which of course was the story of Christ, directed by Nicholas Ray, famous for directing Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean. That was released in 1961, but a few years later came The Greatest Story Ever Told, directed by George Stevens. In fact, it was in development when King of Kings was released. It took quite some time to reach the screen, and it's a very, very elaborate story reflecting the elaborateness of the film itself. And we have this program, another hardcover that went along with the release of the film. And if you remember from my earlier video, movies that were released as roadshow engagements had hard tickets for reserved seats. The movies were only shown twice a day in specially selected theaters, in widescreen and stereophonic sound. There was an overture, an intermission, exit music, all designed with great showmanship to be an experience that was beyond just going to another movie. Now, The Greatest Story Ever Told was intended to be sort of George Stevens' magnum opus. He was deeply disturbed by what he saw in World War II, the horrible things that happened during that conflict, and was changed what he wanted to do as a filmmaker. Certainly, The Diary of Anne Frank, another roadshow attraction, was part of that. But he really wanted to tell the ultimate story of man's inhumanity to man, but also humanity's redemption. That is, of course, the story of Jesus. And his springboard for that was The Greatest Story Ever Told, which is a novel by Fulton Oursler, based on the radio show that ran for almost 10 years, starting in 1947 through 1956. And the novel was published in 1949. Now, indeed, this was a novelization of the New Testament story of Jesus, an attempt to tell the narrative of the Gospels as a novel. And it's very skillfully done. Certainly that title, The Greatest Story Ever Told, is extremely well known and is very catchy, one might say. So George Stevens bought the rights to that novel. And then as things went on, and I think it was Time magazine noted in their story about the making of the film, the novel was basically forgotten. George Stevens went in a different direction. He was an incredibly skillful filmmaker. Anybody that has seen A Place in the Sun, or indeed The Diary of Anne Frank, knows that. And he ended up wanting to make just an incredible impact. It's a little hard to tell from a movie that is so intended to be seen on the big screen. It was filmed in Ultra Panavision and presented as a Cinerama movie. So it's meant to be seen in the theater in this roadshow experience, and it's a little hard to tell what the impact was meant to be when we see it on television, especially if we're watching it on our phones. It's meant to have an impact visually, more so than a character-driven or a traditional narrative. And interestingly enough, this program reflects that, because unlike most of these programs, it doesn't have any information about the making of the film. It's very elegantly put together, and it opens with this sort of poetic reflection on the life of Jesus. Beautiful photography with images from the film. And then the credits for the film. And it's really put together so beautifully. Look, we have this little cutout here, so that when we look at the page, we see some of the characters played by these movie stars. And then we turn the page and see that it's this much bigger photograph of Jesus riding into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, emphasizing here the baby Jesus being held by Mary. So there's lots of truly beautiful aspects to this book as a work of art in itself. Here we have the grieving figure of Mary as played by Dorothy McGuire. And just some really incredible photography. But that's it, and it really seems to reflect the visual impact rather than a lot of text or narrative that the film was going for. Even though it does have that impact, it's always kind of worked against the film as a popular hit. Another thing that works up against it, I mentioned Dorothy McGuire is in it, as Mary, but it has all kinds of stars in little cameos. And that ultimately is just a distraction. There's a great many stars playing little cameos, and even though there are some full-fledged performances by, say, Charlton Heston as John the Baptist, there's also just very brief appearances by Sidney Poitier, by John Wayne. Angela Lansbury's in it as Pontius Pilate's wife, and Judith Crist, the movie critic, famously said that Angela Lansbury's performance is a flash in the Panavision because she's in it only for a few seconds. So a lot of it seems like stunt casting, and I think George Stevens was going for kind of a power, but it kind of works against the film. Speaking of the actors that are in the film, Michael Anderson Jr. plays James the Younger, one of the apostles, and my patron saint. He has one of my favorite moments in the film.
What is your name, my friend?
James. Little James. They call me Little because I'm the youngest. What is your name?
Jesus.
That's a good name.
Thank you.
I've always really liked that. And you might recall me bringing up Michael Anderson Jr. He, of course, is in Search of the Castaways with Haley Mills. Here's one of my favorite Disney images, as I talked about in the Disney Lobby Cards video. If you haven't seen that, check that out. And if you're thinking that's the Disney connection I was talking about, not quite. Going to find out about that in just a bit. Here we have the program for Ben-Hur, another spectacular roadshow attraction. And again, this is not really a program, it's a full-fledged book, complete with hardcovers. To go along with what I'm saying, the official title is Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. So the events in the life of Ben-Hur intersect with the life of Jesus. And it's quite fascinating how that's all done and so skillfully done. And again, this is just a spectacular program. Here we have a fold-out showing one of the most immense and epic of all the settings of Ben-Hur's most famous scene and sequence, which is, of course, the chariot race. So look at this. It's just incredible and so wonderful to kind of pore over. All kinds of information on the film, background on the book itself on which it was based. And there was a stage production and, of course, a silent film before this 1959 version. Lots of color photography to tell the story of the film. Captures all the sweep and the epic nature of this roadshow attraction. And here is Jesus, and famously, he is only seen from the back in this movie. And he really has a wonderful theme. The score for the movie, which is so beautiful and so powerful, was composed by Miklos Rozsa, and he really came up with some wonderful themes, including one that is always heard when Jesus is on screen, or maybe even talked about. There's a lot of information about William Wyler, the director, all the background information, all about the costumes, the sets, all very fascinating. Here's a picture of Miklos Rozsa. And in the last part of the book, there are these beautiful paintings, which I'll show you in a minute. MGM commissioned these, I think, to show previous to filming, to help promote this movie that was in production for years without having to show any of the photography from the movie, and also just to hint at it, to tease it, rather than showing actual scenes or actual stills. This is where the Disney connection comes in, because this beautiful art was done by Ben Stahl. He later wrote a book called Blackbeard's Ghost, basically about 10 years later. And he was having lunch one day with Walt Disney and told him about the book. Walt told him, "You should definitely write that book, and when you're done, show it to me. I'd like to see it." And indeed, Ben Stahl completed the book with his own illustrations, of course, sent it to Walt, And the same day that the book was accepted by a publisher, Walt said, I would like to get the film rights for this. And of course, that was made as a Disney film. And you can read more about this in my article for D23. The film was released after Walt's death, but it was in production in 1966, just before Walt Disney died. But to bring us back to the program, it has this wonderful fold out, all these paintings by Ben Stahl. And indeed, these were used in the teaser trailer. These were intended to be taken out of the book and displayed or framed even, and they are really beautiful and very, very striking. And it really points out how beautifully and skillfully this movie about Ben-Hur intertwines the story of Jesus. And we have some illustrations of these key moments in Jesus' life, including the crucifixion. But how does the film deal with the resurrection, which is the conclusion of the story and not the easiest thing to portray? So how does the film do it? At the very conclusion of the film, after all that has gone before it. Just a very striking image, and that incredible score that lifts us to the heavens.